There are stories the land remembers long after the people who live them are gone. And this one starts not with a hero, but with a man at the end of his rope. His name was Boone Marlowe, last of his line. He was holding on to a ranch that was more dust than dirt, with nothing but a broken-down fence, a creek bed full of cracked earth, and a half-wild dog who was better at listening than most people. It was 1891 in the Texas Hill Country. October. The sun didn't just shine, it punished. Boone wasn't looking for trouble that evening. He wasn't looking for anything. He was just riding the fence line, counting the ribs on his cattle and trying not to count the days until the bank came to take what was left of his father's dream. But then his horse, a stubborn old mare named Clementine, veered off the trail. She stopped dead near Widow's Gulch, pawing at the dirt, her ears twitching like she'd heard a ghost. And that's when he saw it. Down in the gully, a wagon lay shattered, not just broken, but splintered into 1,000 pieces, like a giant had snapped it over his knee. But that wasn't the strange part. The wood was scorched black, charred, but only on the inside, as if the fire that destroyed it had burned from within. There was no sign of a campfire, no logic to it, just a wagon that had seemingly turned on itself, consumed by an impossible flame. Beneath the wreckage, half buried in the red dust, was a shape, a woman, or what was left of one. She was curled up like a field mouse trying to hide from a hawk. Her dress was torn to ribbons, her face was scorched by the sun, and her lips were cracked and bleeding. But it was the marks on her wrists that made Boone's blood run cold. They weren't bruises from ropes or shackles. They were burns, perfect, intricate circles branded deep into her skin, like some kind of ritual scarring. Boone slid from his saddle, his heart pounding a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice hoarse from disuse. No answer. But he saw it, a tiny fluttering movement in her chest. A breath. He knelt beside her, reaching out a hesitant hand. The air around her felt cold, unnaturally so, despite the blistering Texas heat. He gently touched her shoulder. Her eyes snapped open. They were a pale, feverish green, and for a second, they didn't seem to see him at all. They looked right through him, as if staring at something far, far away. And then she whispered. It wasn't her name. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a warning. 4 words that made no sense. "He can hear the water." And then she was gone. Her eyes rolled back, and she went limp in his arms, a feather-light bundle of skin, bones, and secrets. Boone didn't know who he was or what she meant, but as he lifted her onto his horse, he looked back at the wagon, burned from the inside out, and felt a deep, primal chill snake down his spine. He had a feeling he hadn't just found a lost woman. He had found the epicenter of something terrible. It took 2 hours to get her back to the ranch. She weighed next to nothing, a fragile thing that whispered nonsense the whole way. Names he didn't know, places he'd never heard of. He laid her down in his mother's old room, a place that still smelled faintly of lavender and old memories. He cleaned the grime from her face, bandaged her wounds as best he could, and sat by her bedside as the fever raged. For 3 days she was a ghost in his house, a silent, breathing question mark. On the 4th morning she woke up. She didn't stir slowly. She shot bolt upright in the bed, eyes wide with terror, her gaze darting to the window like a cornered animal looking for an escape. "Where am I?" she rasped, her voice like sandpaper. "Marlowe Ranch," Boone said, his voice gentle. He'd been nursing the same cup of coffee for an hour, waiting. "You're safe here." Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the simple wooden furniture, the faded quilt, the quiet stillness of the place. Then her gaze landed on the wall above the door, and her breath hitched in her throat. Hanging there, decorative and unused for 30 years, was his grandfather's old branding iron, the Marlowe family brand. A simple circle with a lightning strike through the middle. "I didn't steal nothing," she blurted out, her voice trembling. "The horse, the provisions. I didn't take them. He lies." Boone frowned. "I didn't say you did." "I don't want no trouble," she said, pulling the sheets up to her chin, her eyes still locked on the iron brand. Boone stood up, his joints popping in the morning quiet. Then you'll fit right in, he said. That seemed to break the spell. She blinked and some of the terror receded from her eyes, replaced by a deep, hollow weariness. Her name, she said, was Ramsey Clare. And that was all she gave him. No family, no hometown, no story of the wagon. Just a name that felt as borrowed as the shirt she was wearing. For a week, she moved through his house like a phantom. She tried to work, tried to make herself useful, but she was clumsy, weak, her hands shaking so bad she could barely hold a plate. It was like her body had forgotten how to be in the world. She spent hours staring out at the parched, dead land surrounding the ranch. One morning, Boone found her standing barefoot on the porch, her eyes fixed on a barren ridge to the west, a place where not even weeds would grow. There's water under that hill, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Boone almost laughed. The drought had been strangling this land for 2 years. He knew every dry creek, every dusty well, every inch of his property. Ain't rained proper in ages, he said, trying not to sound dismissive. I've dug 3 wells over there. All of them came up bone dry. Ramsey didn't argue. She just walked off the porch, knelt on the cracked earth, and pressed her palm flat against the ground. She closed her eyes. Her whole body went still, as if she were listening to a song only she could hear. It's moving slow, she murmured, her voice distant. Trapped. But it's there, under the false bottom. She looked up at him, her green eyes clear and certain. Give it 3 days. It'll break through. Boone didn't know what a false bottom was. He didn't know what to believe. This woman was half-starved, half-mad, and talking about water like it was a living thing she could hear sleeping under the ground. But something in her certainty made him hesitate. You a well witch? He asked, the words feeling foolish on his tongue. She flinched, a movement so sharp it was like he'd struck her. I've been called that, she said, her gaze dropping to her trembling hands. Among other things. What kind of things? Her voice dropped so low he had to lean in to hear it. A vessel, an oracle, a liar. She looked up, and the look in her eyes was ancient, filled with a sorrow that didn't belong in a woman so young. He said I had the knowing, said I could hear the earth's secrets. Boone waited. But I'd rather be nobody, she whispered, her voice breaking, than go back to being his. He didn't ask who his was. He didn't have to. He just nodded and walked away. He didn't believe her, not really, but he didn't disbelieve her either. On the 3rd morning, a patch of dark, wet soil appeared on the western ridge. By noon it was a muddy seep. By sundown, a tiny crystal-clear spring was bubbling up from the ground, spilling life back into a place that had been dead for a generation. Boone stood over it, the cool, damp earth in his hands feeling more precious than gold. He looked back at the ranch house where Ramsey was watching him from the porch, and he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that this woman wasn't a stray. She wasn't a runaway. She was something else entirely, something powerful, and something that powerful, he figured, would have powerful enemies. The water changed everything. It wasn't a river, not even a creek, but it was enough. Enough to save his herd, enough to give the land a fighting chance. It was a miracle born from madness, and Boone guarded it like a dragon guards its hoard. That night by the fire, Ramsey finally started to talk. The story came out in pieces, jagged and sharp, like shards of broken glass. My grandmother raised me, she began, her voice low and steady against the crackle of the mesquite wood. She said our family had a connection. We could feel the changes in the earth, the pressure shifts before a storm, the deep currents of groundwater. Like our bones were weather vanes. Boone just listened, nursing his coffee, letting the silence draw the story out of her. She called it the weather sense. She taught me how to read the patterns in the wind, the behavior of the animals. It ain't magic, it's just paying attention. Boone grunted. Sounds like a gift. Ramsey's face darkened, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows across her features. That's what he called it. There was no need to ask who. The name hung in the air between them, unspoken but heavy as a tombstone. I was 16 when I met him, Dr. Elwood Granger. He ran a traveling show, called it the Congregation of the Divine Providence. Part preacher, part showman, all snake, her hands clenched in her lap. He didn't just sell potions. He sold hope. He told people I could read their futures, that I had the touch. He'd ask me about the weather, and I'd tell him. He'd ask about the water, and I'd point. And when I was right, they started to believe. Believe what? Boone asked, his voice a low rumble. Everything, she whispered. That I was a prophet. That he was my guide. He built a church around my gift. People followed him, gave him everything they had. He sold me to them in pieces. A prayer for $1, a prophecy for 5. She stared into the flames, her eyes seeing a past he could only imagine. The worst part was, sometimes I did know things. I'd feel a sickness in someone, a sorrow, and he'd twist it. He'd turn their pain into his profit. We were in Abilene. A woman came with a sick baby. Granger sold her one of his blessed tonics. The child died the next day. Her voice cracked. He told the whole town it was my fault, that my faith had faltered and I'd soured the blessing. That's when I knew. He wasn't just a charlatan. He was a monster. So you ran? I tried, she said, a bitter smile touching her lips. One night south of Blanco, I told him I was done, that I wouldn't be his puppet anymore. He just smiled, that cold, empty smile of his. He told me I didn't understand, that I belonged to him, that we had a covenant. She took a shaky breath. He had his men hold me down. They heated a branding iron in the fire. He said it was the seal of our pact, the symbol of his congregation. Boone sat forward, his knuckles white around his coffee mug. The wagon, it didn't break down, did it? Ramsey shook her head, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. No, he had them break the wheel. Then they lit a fire inside it with oil and chemicals I'd never seen. A fire that burned without smoke. They drove off and left me there. To be erased. To die in the sun, a madwoman found beside a freak accident. Silence descended, thick and suffocating. Boone didn't offer pity. Her story was too raw for that. But that night, long after Ramsey had gone to bed, Boone took his father's old rifle from the mantel, sat on the porch, and watched the long, dark road leading to his ranch. Because he knew something for a fact. A man like Elwood Granger, a man who built his church on a girl's gift and tried to erase her with a smokeless fire. He doesn't like loose ends. He always comes back to finish the job. 2 weeks went by. The spring flowed, and a small patch of green began to spread from it like a promise. For the first time in years, the ranch felt like it was breathing again. Ramsey was changing too. The haunted look in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a quiet strength. She worked alongside Boone, her hands growing calloused, her face turning brown from the sun. She was becoming a part of the place. Then the flyer appeared. It wasn't nailed to the post in town. It was delivered by a rider in a crisp, clean duster who didn't say a word. He just handed Boone the paper, tipped his hat, and rode off into the dust. It wasn't a wanted poster. It was worse. It was printed on expensive paper, with elegant, curling script. It was a proclamation of concern. It spoke of a beloved ward, a troubled young woman named Lark Eden, who had wandered away from the care of her guardian, Dr. Elwood Granger. It mentioned her delicate mental state and episodes of fantasy. It offered a reward of $50 for any information leading to her safe return. But it was the sketch that made Boone's blood turn to ice. It was Ramsey. Her eyes, her mouth, the shape of her face. It was her. And at the bottom there were 2 signatures. The first was Dr. Elwood Granger, president of the Divine Providence Society. The second, stamped with the official seal of the Texas Marshals, was a name that hit Boone like a punch to the gut. Trace Langston, his cousin. Ramsey was standing behind him, drying her hands on an apron. She saw the look on his face, the way the blood had drained from it. She didn't have to read the paper. She knew. He's found me, she whispered. He's done more than that, Boone said, his voice flat and hard. He's made you out to be a crazy girl and a runaway. He's made it so anyone who helps you is breaking the law. He tapped the second signature, and he's got my cousin to sign off on it. Ramsey's eyes widened. The marshal, he's your family? We grew up on this land together, Boone said, the words tasting like rust. Then his father died. The bank took their ranch, and Trace decided he liked the law more than the dirt. He traded his boots for a badge and never looked back. A cold understanding passed between them. This wasn't just about Granger anymore. This was about family, about the law, and about two different worlds colliding right here on Boone's porch. The first riders came 3 days later. Not lawmen, not yet. These were Granger's men. They wore clean clothes and polished boots, but their eyes were hard and empty. They sat on their horses at the edge of Boone's property, just watching, unblinking, like vultures waiting for something to die. The next day, Granger came himself. He rode a fine black stallion and wore a preacher's coat, a brilliant white smile plastered on his face. He looked completely out of place in the dust and the drought, like a perfectly polished lie. Two of his men flanked him, their hands resting on their sidearms. Ramsey saw them from the barn and darted back into the shadows, her face pale with terror. Boone met Granger at the fence, his own hand resting on the Colt revolver at his hip. "Afternoon, sir," Granger said, his voice smooth as oil. "A lovely piece of property, though it appears to be suffering from the prevailing conditions." "It's doing just fine," Boone said. "Is it?" Granger's smile widened. "I've come from my ward, Miss Lark Eden. I have it on good authority she sought refuge here." "I don't know anyone by that name." Granger's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Oh, I think you do. The law is on my side, Mr. Marlowe. I have a writ, signed by Marshal Langston himself, granting me guardianship. She is unwell. She needs my care." "The only thing she needs is to be away from you," Boone growled. The preacher's smile finally faltered, replaced by a flash of cold fury. "You are a man clinging to a dying legacy, Mr. Marlowe. This land is mortgaged to the hilt. The bank in Lampasas owns more of it than you do. You think you're in a position to defy me? To defy the law? For a girl who is, shall we say, prone to hysterics?" Boone stood his ground. "She's not going with you," Granger chuckled, a low, condescending sound. "This isn't a request." He gestured to the parched land around them. "This place is already a grave. Don't make me dig another one." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving his two men behind. They were still there, watching, waiting. That night, the silence in the ranch house was deafening. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind sounded like a threat. "He'll ruin you," Ramsey said, her voice a dead monotone. She was staring out the window at the two dark shapes sitting on their horses in the moonlight. "He'll use the law. He'll use your cousin. He'll take this ranch and burn it to the ground just to get to me." She turned to face him, her eyes full of a terrible, resigned sadness. "I have to go," she whispered, "while there's still something left here to save." Boone didn't answer. Instead, he walked over to a dusty shelf and pulled down a battered old ledger. His father's ledger. Inside were records of rainfall, cattle counts, and debts. But there was something else, too. Faded entries from his grandfather's time. Stories, rumors, notes about the land. He flipped through the brittle pages, his finger tracing the elegant, old-fashioned script. He stopped on a page dated 1852. His grandfather had written about a terrible drought, much like this one. About how the herds were dying, the wells were dry, and all hope was lost. And then one line, underlined twice, caught his eye. "Met the preacher. He promised rain for a price. A covenant for the land's lifeblood." Boone looked up from the ledger, his eyes meeting Ramsey's. A horrifying idea was beginning to form in his mind, a connection that stretched back decades. "This man Granger," he said, his voice low. "Does he ever talk about his family? His ancestors?" Ramsey frowned. "He called himself the inheritor of the covenant. Said his grandfather made a pact with this valley a long time ago. A pact that gave him influence over it." Boone's blood ran cold. He looked from the ledger to the branding iron on the wall to the woman standing before him. It wasn't a coincidence. None of it. Granger wasn't just here for her. He was here for the land, for a debt his family had owed for 40 years. "He's not just coming back for you," Boone said, his voice grim. "He's coming back to collect." The air in the room crackled with a sudden, terrifying understanding. Ramsey walked over to the fireplace and stared up at the Marlowe family brand, her expression a mixture of fear and dawning recognition. "The covenant," she whispered. her hand rising to touch the scarred circles on her own wrist. The brand he gave me, it's the same symbol. Boone felt the floor drop out from beneath him. He snatched the branding iron from the wall, the metal cold and heavy in his hand. He held it up next to Ramsey's wrist. It was a perfect match. The circle, the lightning strike through the middle. This is my family's brand, he stammered. It's been in my family for 100 years. How? He told me it was the symbol of his divine providence, Ramsey said, her voice trembling as the pieces fell into place. He said it represented God's power striking the earth. But it was a lie. It was always a lie. She looked at Boone, her eyes wide with a terrible revelation. It's your brand. He's using your family's mark as his holy symbol. But why? Boone turned back to the ledger, his hands shaking as he flipped through the pages. He found another entry, just a few weeks after the first. The preacher delivered. Rain came. The springs returned. But the cost is high. The land feels wrong, hollowed out. He took more than water. He took its spirit. The pact is sealed. The brand is the mark of it. A 40-year-old secret written in his grandfather's hand. A deal with a devil who called himself a preacher. My grandfather, Boone said, his voice a choked whisper. He made a deal to end a drought. He traded the land's, its lifeblood, for rain. And Granger's grandfather was the man he made the deal with. It all made sense now. The unnatural drought, Granger's obsession with this specific valley, Ramsey's ability to feel the trapped water, the land's pain. The land wasn't just dry, it was cursed, imprisoned. And Ramsey's gift wasn't just about finding water. It was a key. She could hear the land crying for release. Granger doesn't want me, Ramsey said, her voice filled with a new, steely resolve. He needs me. As long as he has me, the oracle who can hear the water, he controls the source. He can keep the curse going. But if I'm free, you can break it, Boone finished for her. A new kind of silence fell between them. It wasn't fear anymore. It was the calm before a storm. He thinks I'm your weakness, Ramsey said, that he can use me to break you. Boone looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, at the impossible strength that had allowed her to survive. He smiled a true, grim smile. Then maybe, he said, we don't hide you. Maybe we show them just what you can do. He strode to the door and threw it open, staring out at the two sentinels still watching from the darkness. If we're going to fight for this land, he said, his voice ringing out in the night air, we're going to need an army. The next morning, Boone Marlowe did something he hadn't done in 10 years. He rode for help. He left Ramsey at the ranch, locked in with the dog and his rifle, and he rode to his neighbors, Tom Wheeler, Jake Simmons. Men who were just as desperate, just as close to ruin as he was. He didn't tell them about curses or ancient pacts. He knew they'd call him crazy. He told them something they would understand. He told them about water. There's a woman at my ranch, he said, looking Tom Wheeler dead in the eye. She can find water. She found a spring on my land where there hasn't been one in 50 years. She says your land has it too, and west of the ridgeline, by Big Hollow. Wheeler just stared at him, his face a mask of sun-baked skepticism. And you expect me to believe that? I expect you to believe your own eyes, Boone said. But there's a problem. A man named Granger. He claims she's his ward, and that she's crazy. He's got a writ from the marshal, and he's trying to take her back. But it's not about her, it's about the water. He wants to control it. He let that sink in. In this parched land, water was power. It was life. The idea of one man controlling it all was a terrifying thought. He spent the whole day riding, telling the same story, his voice growing raw. Some men laughed him off, but 3 of them, the ones who were closest to the edge, listened. They saw the desperation in Boone's eyes, and they felt a flicker of hope. They agreed to meet at his ranch at sundown. But as Boone rode home, the sky darkening to a bruised purple, he saw a lone rider approaching. The setting sun glinted off the star on his chest. Marshal Trace Langston. Trace dismounted, his movements stiff and formal. The years had not been kind to him. They had carved deep lines into his face and left a permanent coldness in his eyes. Boone, he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. Trace, I figured you'd show your face eventually. I'm here on official business, Trace said, pulling the writ from his coat. I have a legal document for the return of Lark Eden to her guardian. Boone didn't even look at the paper. You know that's a lie. You know what kind of man Granger is. I know he has a legal claim, Trace snapped. I'm not a judge, Boone. I'm an officer of the law. I enforce it. This territory is one bad drought away from tearing itself apart. If people start believing that contracts and debts don't matter, we'll have chaos. There's a difference between law and justice, Trace. You used to know that. A flicker of something, pain, memory, crossed Trace's face. Things change, he said curtly. Elara wouldn't think so, Boone said, his voice dangerously quiet. The name hit Trace like a physical blow. Elara, the woman they had both loved. The woman who had died of a fever 10 years ago, leaving a hole in both their lives that had never healed. It was her death that had driven Trace to the rigid certainty of the law and driven Boone deeper into the solitude of the ranch. You leave her out of this, Trace hissed. I can't, Boone said, pressing his advantage, because I've been reading our grandfather's journals. He wrote about a traveling preacher who came through during the last big drought, a man who promised miracles. Trace went very still. What are you talking about? Granger's not new to this valley, Trace. His family has been here before. Elara got sick right after she went to one of his revivals down by the river, didn't she? We all thought it was just a fever. But what if it wasn't? What if she saw something she shouldn't have? What if she found out what Granger's miracles really cost? The accusation hung in the air, terrible and unspoken. Trace's carefully constructed wall of order and law began to crack. He looked toward the ranch house where a light had just appeared in the window. Just then, the screen door creaked open. Ramsey stepped out onto the porch. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't afraid. She stood there bathed in the warm lamplight and looked directly at the marshal. If you're going to take me, she said, her voice clear and steady, then you look me in the eye when you do it. But you should know, he's not the only one who made a pact for this land. Trace stared at her. This was not the hysterical, troubled girl described in the writ. This was a woman made of steel and sorrow, calm as a storm front. Before he could respond, 3 more riders appeared over the rise, Tom Wheeler and the others. They rode up and positioned their horses beside Boone's, their faces grim, their hands resting on their rifles. They didn't say a word. They didn't have to. It was 4 ranchers against the law, a losing battle. But then Ramsey lifted her head, sniffing the air. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. It's coming, she whispered. A low rumble echoed in the distance. Thunder. You have until midnight, Boone, Trace said, his voice strained, his certainty shaken. At midnight, I enforce the writ. He mounted his horse and rode off, not back to town, but to a nearby bluff where he could watch. A man caught between the law he'd sworn to uphold and the ghost of his past. The ranchers looked at Boone, then at Ramsey. You said she could find water, Wheeler said, his voice gruff. Ramsey stepped off the porch, her bare feet sinking into the cool dust. She raised her hand to the sky, feeling the pressure shift, the electricity in the air. I can, she said, her voice ringing with a newfound power. But we have to hurry. He'll try to stop us. And as the first fat raindrop hit the dust at her feet, she pointed toward the dark, ominous shape of Big Hollow. The heart of the valley is there, she declared, and it's about to wake up. What happened next became the stuff of legend in the hill country. They rode into the storm. It wasn't a normal Texas thunderstorm. It was a violent, angry tempest, as if the sky itself was at war. Lightning split the heavens, illuminating the land in brief, terrifying flashes. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at their clothes and whipping dust into their eyes. At the head of the small procession was Ramsey. Barefoot, her hair whipping around her face, she seemed to draw power from the storm. She wasn't fighting it. She was a part of it. Boone rode at her side, his rifle across his saddle, his eyes scanning the darkness. The other 3 ranchers followed, their skepticism washed away by the sheer, raw intensity of the moment. The earth remembers, Ramsey cried out over the wind, her voice not shouting but resonating with the thunder. The water remembers the way home. They reached the base of the ridge near Big Hollow, a desolate maze of rock and dead trees. "Here!" Ramsay yelled, sliding from her horse. She ran to a wide, flat basin of cracked earth and fell to her knees, pressing her palms flat against the ground. She began to chant. It was a low melodic sound, a language older than words. It was the weather sense her grandmother had taught her, a song of communion with the earth. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Boone saw it, a tremor in the ground, a fine shiver that ran through the soles of his boots. A dark line snaked across the dry basin floor. A crack, then another, and another. Suddenly, with a deep groaning sound, the ground gave way. A geyser of crystal-clear water erupted from the earth, shooting 20 feet into the air, a fountain of life released from its ancient prison. The ranchers stared, their mouths agape as the water pooled, forming a fast-growing pond. It was more water than they had seen in 2 years, a true miracle. But their celebration was cut short. A voice, slick and cold as a serpent, cut through the storm. "A magnificent performance, my dear, truly." Dr. Elwood Granger stood on the ridge above them, the lightning flashing behind him, making him look like a demon silhouetted against the apocalypse. He wasn't alone. At least a dozen of his followers were with him, emerging from the rocks like specters. They all held rifles. "You are breaking the covenant, Oracle," Granger said, his voice amplified by the strange acoustics of the hollow. "The tithe must be paid. The land's suffering is what gives us strength." One of his men raised a rifle, aiming it directly at Ramsay. Boone saw it. He raised his own rifle, but he was too slow. A shot rang out, but it didn't come from Boone or Granger's man. It came from the side, from the bluff. Granger's man cried out and fell, clutching a shattered arm. Everyone turned to see Marshal Trace Langston, sitting on his horse, his revolver smoking in his hand. "You had your writ, Granger," Trace yelled, his voice cutting through the wind. "But this isn't law. This is madness." Granger's face contorted in a mask of pure rage. "You meddling fool! You have no idea what you're interfering with." He turned to his men. "Kill them all! The girl is mine!" The hollow exploded into a chaos of gunfire and thunder. Boone and the ranchers took cover, returning fire, the flashes of their rifles like fireflies in the storm. But Ramsay didn't move. She remained on her knees beside the newly born spring, her eyes closed, her chanting growing louder, more powerful. The ground began to shake violently, not just a tremor this time, but a deep, violent convulsion. "She's waking it all up!" Granger screamed, his voice laced with panic. "She's breaking the seal!" He drew his own pistol and charged down the ridge, his eyes fixed on Ramsay, a man possessed. Boone saw him coming. He fired, but his shot went wide. Granger was almost upon her. Suddenly, a figure slammed into him from the side. It was Trace. He'd abandoned his horse and his badge, and was now just a man fighting for redemption. He and Granger wrestled in the mud and the rising water, two forces of order and chaos locked in a death struggle. Ramsay's chanting reached a crescendo. With a final, earth-shattering roar, the entire floor of Big Hollow collapsed. Water, held captive for 40 years, erupted from a dozen new springs at once. A flash flood, a tidal wave of pure, clean water, roared through the hollow. It swept away Granger's men, their cries swallowed by the deluge. Boone grabbed Ramsay, pulling her onto a high rock just as the wave crashed against it. He saw Trace land a final, desperate punch, sending Granger stumbling backward, directly into the path of the torrent. The last thing Boone saw of Dr. Elwood Granger was his face, a mask of disbelief, before the water claimed him and washed him away into the darkness. Then as quickly as it began, it was over. The violent storm softened to a gentle, steady rain. The roar of the flood subsided, replaced by the gurgle of a dozen new creeks, all flowing from Big Hollow, all bringing life back to the valley. The curse was broken. By morning, the hill country was transformed. The creeks that had been dry for years now ran full and clear. The dusty ground was dark and saturated, already showing the first hints of green. The air, once thick with dust, smelled clean and sweet, like life itself. Granger was gone. Some of his followers were found miles downstream, battered and broken. They told wild stories of a water witch and a devil preacher, stories that no one in authority believed. Trace Langston was a changed man. He had a broken arm and a new understanding of the world. He quietly filed a report stating that Dr. Granger and his associates had been caught in a flash flood while illegally prospecting. The case was closed. But the real story, the one whispered from ranch to ranch, was about Boone Marlowe and the strange woman who listened to the dirt. A week later, Boone found Ramsey sitting under the big cottonwood tree where his parents were buried. She was holding a small, weathered wooden chest. "The water washed it out of the gully," she said, her voice soft. "Where you found me." Inside were journals, dozens of them. They were filled with the same elegant script as his grandfather's ledger. They were weather diaries, detailed accounts of the land, the water, the seasons. They were signed Tia Monroe. "That's my real name," she said, looking up at him. "My family, the Monroes. We were the keepers of this place before your family came. We didn't own the land. We just listened to it." Boone looked from the journals to her face, to the green, vibrant land all around them. "Ramsey Clare was just a name I picked," she continued, "a name to hide behind." "Should I start calling you Tia?" he asked. She smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "No, Ramsey is the one who survived, the one who fought back. I think I'll keep her." She paused. "Besides, Tia Monroe sounds like a ghost. Ramsey Marlowe sounds solid." Boone's heart skipped a beat. He didn't have a ring. He didn't have much of anything except a healing ranch, a loyal dog, and a future that had, until recently, been a blank page. He knelt in front of her, in the damp, living soil. "I don't know much about listening to the dirt," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I think I'm starting to learn how to listen to my heart. And it's saying I don't want to spend another day without you." She didn't need to answer with words. She just leaned forward and kissed him, a kiss that tasted of rain and earth and second chances. They were married the following Sunday, right there under the cottonwood tree. Trace was there, his arm in a sling, his hat in his hands. The other ranchers who had fought beside them stood as witnesses. There was no preacher. They didn't need one. The land itself was their church. And as Boone placed a hand on Ramsey's still flat stomach, a shared secret passing between them, she leaned her head against his chest. "Looks like the drought is finally over," she whispered. Boone kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair. "The rain helped," he said, "but you were the storm that saved us all." The legend of Ramsey Clare, the water witch of hill country, lived on for generations. They say the springs she woke that day have never run dry, and the land in that valley is the greenest in all of Texas. She and Boone filled the old ranch house with children, and she taught every one of them how to walk barefoot after a storm and listen. Not for magic, but for the quiet, steady heartbeat of the earth. A reminder that sometimes the most broken places and the most broken people are just waiting for the right person to come along and remind them how to live again. This story is a powerful reminder that there are forces at work in the world we may never fully understand. The line between a curse and a miracle can sometimes be as thin as a drop of rain. What do you think? Was Ramsey's gift supernatural or just a deep understanding of the natural world? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey into a forgotten corner of the Old West, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that explore the strange and unusual places where history and mystery collide. Thanks for listening.